I didn't know we were going to get to hold microphones.
I know. It's very exciting.
Well, I just thank you all for coming out, first of all, to celebrate Ayana's wonderful novel. I think what we're going to do, we've been asked to talk to each other and to you for 20 or 25 minutes or so, and then what we'll do is we'll open up the event to questions and answers, so we can sort of have a conversation amongst all of us about the book. I first got to know Ayana when we spent some time together at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And
he's my teacher. We were like spending time.
Well,
it's actually,
I don't think
falsely modest.
I didn't teach her much, but one of the privileges I had was getting to read a lot of what ended up in the book in various states of drafts. I think there were a couple of chapters maybe that you weren't quite sure if they were going to end up in the book, and so it's fascinating to me to see how all these different parts came together and made this wonderful book. And I almost said ambitious, but usually whenever anybody says ambitious, it's like a euphemism, like you tried. Good for you.
But then
that was great. Yeah, what an ambitious book. But it was, it aspired to and succeeds at being a big book, a book that frankly aspires to and achieves being about history and being about people's souls, being about real human beings and about their lives in America and at certain, in certain historical and cultural situations. And so it's only 230 pages long, but it feels like it's 700 pages long because it packs so much into its pages. There's a density to it. There's a lyricism to it, a poetry to it. One of the things I want to ask Ayana about eventually is just the biblical influence because of the 12 Tribes of Hattie. It's this large sort of Old Testament scaled kind of story. So I guess one of the things that I just start off with is, can you talk a little bit about the genesis of the book? The sort of the germ of sort of how it started to grow.
So it started. So I should say. So Paul is my teacher, and the way that Iowa works is that there are guest faculty. So he was my teacher my first year there, the second semester of my first year. So you missed my first semester when I was working on this kind of really bad kind of memoir-ish situation that had to be gotten rid of because it was terrible. And so
I know the feeling.
And and you also know the feeling of sort of we both. Kind of worship a little bit at the altar of Marilyn Robinson, and so this horrid memoir-ish project that had to be gotten rid of was also being workshopped in Marilyn's workshop, and that it didn't go well, and that's fine. So by the time I got to your workshop, I had sort of started working on this book, but I didn't realize that it was a book at first. I thought that I was sort of failing to master the art of compression that is required in the short story. That is, I thought I was writing short stories that were not quite successful as short stories. They kept sort of spilling over the edges of themselves, and it really was slightly accidental almost, and I didn't kind of catch on to what was happening until probably 3 or 4 stories in, when I thought, I just kept thinking, oh, this is such a funny coincidence. All these people, they're in the 50s. It's Philadelphia. It's so funny. Oh, whatever. And then at a certain point, it was, it sort of became apparent that these people were in a family, and it also became apparent, I think probably right around when I wrote Ella, which is a story that I workshopped with you, yep, that Hattie, the mother figure, was going to be sort of the life's blood of the book. And then there was a process of not much. I was again only maybe 3 or 4 stories in, so there was a process of sort of including her a little bit more in some of the stories, in which she was less present. But because I was so early on, and I was sort of fortunate to realize that she was so crucial, that I was able to kind of write from that point on, understanding her, I wouldn't say her role, but understanding how present she needed to be, though I don't think I completely understood her really as a character.
Right. And so then did you then sort of like back into, like, if everything was in the 50s, did you start working backwards and discover the Great Migration and Georgia and the sort of
exactly, because all of these people were sort of, the stories were taking place in the 40s and 50s, and then when Hattie came on the scene, I didn't really know much about her. There was a sort of weird scrap of a prototype of a story that in which there was a woman who was old, who was not named Hattie, who lost her children, and then she sort of returned in this Ella story in a very sort of well, I guess an important way. I didn't realize it was the same woman, and then I finished Ella, which is a story of Hattie sort of she gives up her lastborn because she's in a situation of serious economic duress. At any rate, I didn't understand that this woman in this prototypical sort of weird story that had lost her children was the same woman that was giving up her last-born child. When I did realize that, then it became almost a matter of I wouldn't say that it was purely a matter of chronology, but it became apparent that if she were that age in the 50s, that she had to have been born in the very, very early part of the 20th century, and that she probably had come from somewhere else. And that was when the sort of the Great Migration and all of that stuff kind of came into it, when I realized more fully who she was and where she would have come from.
Right, because she comes up to Philadelphia in 1923, right, with
Yeah.
her mom and her two sisters,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then by extension, did you? I'm kind of interested in the process of then you sort of starting to think about her in terms of the 12 tribes in this sort of more, almost, frankly, biblical kind of scale. First of all, the scale, but also the poetry and the kind of like almost that larger historical context. By the end, when I've read the book 2 or 3 times. Every time I finish it, I just sort of feel like Hattie is everybody's mother. She just sort of looms in this this beautiful, astonishing way that, frankly, echoes the poetry of Genesis and
Thanks. That's quite a compliment.
I take cash.
Yeah, I think so. Sort of backtracking from understanding that when Hattie would have had to have been born roughly and where she would have come from, that was, I think, when this. It is very interesting. I started reading. Isabel Wilkerson's *The Warmth of Other Suns*, which is a sort of definitive nonfiction work about the Great Migration, and I had understood already that Hattie would have had to have been part of the Great Migration, and I had understood also in a very through a very strange sort of twist of events. I was going to Marilyn Robinson's house a lot because she has a huge theological library, and I would go. It's sort of in her living room basically, and I would go there and I would look, and I would sort of looking at things, and I was really fixated on the 12 tribes of Israel, and so I started to think a lot about metaphors for a people that were moving from a situation of bondage into a situation of freedom, in which, however, that freedom that they find is incredibly mingled and messy and sort of not what they expect. But they are nonetheless the founding of a kind of nation. And so, for a while, I almost thought that I would sort of model the chapters after each of those 12 tribes, and sort of name them Gad and Dan and et cetera, and Levi and all that. But then I realized that was far too literal of a reading, and that wasn't going to work. Exactly. It would enormously overdetermined, and also because I think, primarily I really did want to write about Hattie as a character and sort of explore out. Do you know what I mean? So not start from like sort of a big picture in and create a figure that was a symbol of X, Y, and Z, but instead to create a sort of living, breathing, human, fleshed out character upon which all of these forces were certainly sort of exerting their pressure, and of which she is also simultaneously a kind of symbol or a kind of every woman.
Right. But you have to work from character out, because otherwise
Absolutely.
if she's too over schematized, she'd just be a cipher.
She'd be horrible.
Yeah.
She'd be a series of awful cliches about like strength and blackness and movement and horrible.
Yeah. caricature. We were talking about that a little bit earlier, the danger. I mean, and that's one of the other things that I'm sort of, you take the Bible, so, you're putting all the stakes on the table. You're not sort of like, we'll sort of, work towards some kind of blameless. But then there's, if you put all the stakes on the table, then you have to just, as a writer, as an artist, you always want to play with all the stakes on the table, but then that disciplines the writing in a way, because one false move, and you can lapse into caricature, you can lapse into sentimentality. And that sort of leads me to asking about I'm sure it's been noted that the book is sad, and these people live incredibly difficult lives. And I just, as you're talking, I was thinking about the move north into that type of freedom. But then, to me, sort of the hallmark line about the North and Hattie is that she was wounded and chastened by the North. You wrote that, and
I didn't.
But that then that along with my experience of just how beautiful the book is. I was wondering if you could. Have you had to sort of grit your teeth and read reviews and stuff about how sad it is and how tragic it is and all that? And
yeah, it's really funny. I didn't really realize that it was a sad book, until then all the reviews were like, it's so sad, and I would do readings and people would be like, why is this book so sad?
Yeah.
And I was like, my God, I'm sorry. Like, I didn't know. And
Who knew?
and clearly, obviously the characters in this book are leading incredibly difficult lives, and Hattie's life is incredibly difficult. But I think that there's something about, when I was just teaching in Iowa for this semester, and Marilyn Robinson did this amazing seminar on Faulkner, and we were talking about aesthetics, and we were talking about sort of Faulkner's aesthetic in general, and we were also talking about sort of the aesthetics of the language, and there's something in that, in that certainly if you take a book like The Sound and the Fury, or even Absalom, these people are in incredibly despairing situations. Nothing good has happened, will happen. It's not a possibility that anyone's going to have anything joyful happen to them at all.
The threat of hopelessness, the threat of meaninglessness. Right.
But one of the things but I think that two things are sort of happening, and these are two things that I hoped and without being able to articulate it, thought were happening in my own book. Or that, and not making comparison, but the idea here is that, is that there is something about the sort of the role of beauty and the role of truth is creates a kind of sort of buffer against despair. So though the characters are in despairing situations, and though their lives have characteristics of things that are despairing, on another kind of, I think, purely aesthetic level, and as we were sort of saying earlier, aesthetics not in the sense of ornament or prettiness, but beauty not in the sense of ornament or prettiness, but beauty in the sense of some sort of essential part of the fabric of what it means to be alive on the planet, which is not always pleasant, actually.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And quite often isn't, but that there is something about the sort of capaciousness of the human experience that is beautiful, even though perhaps the sort of direct circumstances to which people are subject are actually really quite difficult. And so I think when I was writing the book, my notion was that I think that when it was possible, I tried to sort of create language that in some way was pretty, or that was pleasing to me, or that sounded nice to me when I read it out loud. And I think my kind of pleasure in that prevented me perhaps from seeing the sadness, But I think that the other part of it is that there is this sort of sense that Hattie and her children's experience of being alive, their experience of being sort of participants in the world, being sort of the world and having the world sort of be in them in almost a kind of theological sense, is extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily true, and seemed to me then I didn't see sadness because of that.
Right, and it requires a type of precision and accuracy in the language that the beauty generates itself. That which is closely observed and accurately observed becomes by virtue of those things beautiful. And so then that opens up onto a kind of more profound idea of like what we talk about when we talk about beauty. The idea of aesthetics suddenly is inseparable from value and ethics and people's souls and spirits. Everything's at stake to describe these people's lives in as truthfully as possible, and then that becomes beautiful because you're not lavishing rococo prose on their lives, which would actually smother them. It would be the opposite of beauty.
It would be completely untrue. And sort of going back to this notion of things becoming caricatures of themselves. These sort of like, I think the risk in that with using language that was sort of rococo or whatever it was, or just sort of over the top, would be that you would kind of slide very slowly into the rhythms of language that are used in tropes about talking about hardship. Do you know what I mean? Like if that makes any sense.
No, and also into the type of, to me, it's always sort of morally reprehensible because it becomes picturesque, and when you turn it's sentimentalized, so therefore it becomes acceptable.
Yeah.
It becomes something that's sort of pretty and it's digestible, and nobody's really going to be upset by it because it all sounds sort of noble. To live such difficult lives.
So patronizing and hideous. Do you know what I mean? To think that people who are suffering are noble because of their
right.
suffering.
And I think that's also something that I found at work here that I find in Faulkner as well is also the idea that if these people were to attempt to account for themselves in narrative prose, they might not be able to generate the kind of prose that Faulkner or Ayana can. But the complexity and the complexity of the prose, though, is just a way of saying that doesn't mean that these people's lives are any less complicated or sophisticated than somebody who had the sort of the ability to put it into narrative, into that kind of richer vocabulary. Or
it's an interesting question.
It's experiential. Sorry,
it's an interesting question. It's a sort of an aside, but when I was teaching this semester, a question came up about it. Somebody was writing a story about a character who I think he was maybe a mechanic, or I forget what his sort of job was, but he didn't have a lot of education, and so this person's question was, and the prose was very beautiful that was being used to describe this person as in his experience and his sort of internal world, which was incredibly rich. And so then this question came up, well, if he, even in the sections that were not dialogue, if this person, if I'm sort of writing about this person in language that he himself would not be able to access in order to describe his own experience, is there something false about that?
Right.
And I don't really know why I'm saying that, except that it's really interesting. And I think that is untrue, that do you know what I mean? That certainly the prose that's brought to bear on someone's life, it's sort of by any means necessary. Do you know what I mean? Like when you need to sort of be lyrical and beautiful, you're lyrical beautiful. When you need to be spare, then you're spare.
Right.
But that certainly it is no. Certainly, this idea that someone's that someone is somehow doing a disservice to a character whose ability to articulate his or her experience is not the writer's ability to articulate their experiences is almost kind of like patronizing. There's something sort of wrong there.
It's because the danger is of you inducing something on them that wouldn't be representative.
And underestimating, and by virtue of that, underestimating the breadth and value of that person's or that character's experience.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So that goes back to the importance of working from character out, so that as the character elaborates herself on the page and becomes more complicated, and she has the same kind of ambivalence and complexity of experience that anybody else does, you're able to use your sophistication with narrative and with language and all that to capture what's arising out of her, rather than sort of inducing things on her, which would be
because that's kind of what art does, I suppose. Like in the general, you know what I mean? Like I can't write a symphony, or I can't write sort of my favorite piece of whatever kind of music, but I can certainly feel what is being communicated to me, though I cannot. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like, the whole part
absolutely.
is that I sort of recognize myself or something of myself in this thing that I'm listening to or reading or whatever, regardless of the fact that I can't create it in the terms in which it has been created. Yeah,
it's a fascinating. It's an issue to sort of. It's a mystery to ponder, but never to solve. I think because because on the one hand, talking about music, I'm thinking about the anecdote Beethoven presented his, Opus 132, one of his string quartets, to the premier violin player, in the city, and he said, "Maestro, nobody can play this," and Beethoven's response was, "Do you think I give a damn about you and your fiddle?" So there's the one, But then on the other end, I always think of like William Tyndale, who put the Bible into the first kind of modern English, English, and his job, and he saw his task as to create a translation of the Bible that the boy plowing the field could understand. So there's always that idea, as an artist, you don't want to, because the most patronizing thing to do would be to think you're dumbing down your art but at the same time, you want to be accessible. It's this sort of democratic impulse. I want to write about the most sophisticated things in prose that's so lucid that anybody who has a little bit of patience can, that I want. I don't want it to be exclusive. I want it to be inclusive.
Entirely. Yeah.
What were we talking about? I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Don't mind us.
We've gone on a tangent. We're coming back now. We're back.
And maybe we should get to questions in a little bit, in a couple. But one thing I also wanted to just ask you about too, because it seems a part of so much of the book too, is our issues of class. Money is an issue. The material wealth or lack of it is always sort of being negotiated and it's very complicated. Also, there seems to be almost like there are many more dimensions, but I kept thinking of these X, Y, and Z axes of sort of, there's money, there's sort of the North and the South, and when you're in the South, what does the North seem like? When you're in the North, what does it seem like, and how? And then also there are the issues of skin color, lighter to darker. And at one point, Willie, one of the characters says that Hattie has turned out to be, one of the strongest people she's ever known. And she said, "I don't see that often in high yellow," which is this sort of, kind of opens up on this astonishing realm of, class and caste and just these things being negotiated. So,
well, I thought, I'm glad that you're asking me that, because people don't ask me about class in the book that often, and as much as there's sort of, I always make this joke kind of to myself that when the book comes out in the world and you go and you talk to people and they say, well, when you started writing this, were you thinking of X, Y, or Z, and you're sort of forced to like invent this false narrative about how you were a genius and you like knew the whole thing. No. Yeah, right. And you're like, yeah, exactly, And so, but one of the few things that one of two things that I actually knew when I sort of consciously realized I was writing a book is that I wanted to talk about class, and that I wanted to talk about class among Black people, because it's something that we don't talk about class, period, with anybody, I think, in this country, sort of in general. But that seemed very, very particular, and very necessary to talk about. And one of the things that's happening there is, in sort of Hattie's community, where she lives in Philadelphia, and we could sort of talk about the South secondly, because that's a different kind of can of worms. But in Hattie's community, they are all somewhat sort of existing in a similar state of non-money havingness. Do you know what I mean? Like nobody really has much.
Right.
And so the class hierarchies are being established on the basis of different kinds of things. Skin color is a huge one. So, sort of the lighter, the sort of higher up the chain you are. Diction and speech patterns are another kind of huge thing. If there are differences in diction in the way that the characters speak in the book. Hattie is a much more sort of a quote unquote kind of proper spoken person, and August, her husband, speaks with much more of a kind of southern inflected, not quite dialect, but something close to it. And Hattie's proper spokenness, hand in hand with her light-skinnedness, it sort of put her much higher up on the ladder, and she tends to sort of lord it over her husband and over everyone else, and the whole family does.
The line where she says to August that you were born in a shack and I was born in a house on a hill.
Yeah. I mean, she does. And that kind of stuff. Sort of without going into it. I mean, that kind of stuff. That's a direct kind of slave reference.
Oh yeah,
obviously.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Sort of. She also calls him. She calls him a field hand, and something else that I won't say that she calls him. But so certainly this notion of class that is navigated without sort of absence of the presence of money is a kind of huge and I think very important theme in the book. And then when the South comes into it, Hattie has a sister who remained in the South, whose name is Pearl, and Pearl and her husband are actually quite quite prosperous, and they have become sort of a part of this kind of group of blacks that remained in the South that sort of loosely kind of go along with something called that W.E.B. Du Bois called the talented tenth, and there was this sort of notion that there was a kind of 10% of educated sort of moneyed black people who would kind of lead the rest of the black folks kind of out of darkness. I mean, it's a deeply W.E.B. Du Bois is a genius, but that notion itself is particularly, I think, kind of elitist and a little scary. But at any rate, and so Pearl kind of belongs to that. Loosely, she's not quite in the talented tenth, but she would like to be. Right. She's all about being in the talented tenth. She's sort of
affected in some way. She's
deeply affected.
Right,
She's deeply affected.
Her speech is very
absolutely and very sort of prim and proper, and she sort of subscribes to this kind of sort of Southern belles kind of strangeness that obviously is completely exclusive of any black woman. In that, you know what I mean? But be that as it may, so there is this sort of I think that one of the things that I was trying to do and what I was interested in is obviously to kind of talk about those things, but also to talk about the ways in which in which people who are sort of in a pressure cooker of oppression, and that, in this case, obviously we're talking directly about black people, but we could be talking about people of any race at any time, but people who are in a pressure cooker of oppression, the way that they sort of arrange themselves into identities that are recognizable to everyone and that can make sense to everyone. Because in many ways, that's exactly what's happening. It's deeply unfortunate, obviously. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of horrible that light-skinned is sort of privileged over brown-skinned or, God forbid, dark-skinned, and that is the hierarchy that's established. But it is very much clearly the ways in which people organize themselves. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and then she suffers the beauty, the complexity of all this that I just love. It is that she then suffers the stigma of being on the dole. And, the idea that you can never, it's one thing to be broke, but it's another thing to be broke and go and ask for a handout. So
absolutely.
Her light skin, sort of it gets subverted and suddenly she's within that pressure cooker.
Exactly. Well, and also because, there are some really strict rules. They live in a neighborhood called Germantown. This is in a sort of section of Philadelphia in which they live. And as I said, most of Germantown at the time that most of the book takes place, which is in the 30s, 40s, 50s, was kind of where the sort of higher on the totem pole black people lived, regardless of money. There was also sort of a professional class of blacks that were living in Germantown at that time, but Hattie is not of that professional class. They're sort of aspirant middle class people without any cash. And but there are some very, very strict rules that sort of that govern behavior. Very, very strict. So if you are light skinned and if you are proper spoken and if you live in Germantown, even though you do not have any money, the fact of poverty is accepted by everyone. The fact of poverty is not discussed by anyone.
Right.
And so this notion that you would sort of admit to being poor, and B, go so far as to attempt to find some help with that situation is not only sort of a humiliation, I think, within the framework of the community, but I think it is a humiliation because it acknowledges a kind of defeat at the hands of the larger white world.
Right.
And these people are sort of defiantly refusing to accept any kind of defeat. They live within the sort of confines of their insular society, and they do not want to sort of admit that they're, though they know it, of course. Do you know what I mean? Not defeat, but that certainly there's a mighty struggle going on. Right. And that kind of going on the dole thing is I think an admission of a defeat on 1,000 different levels, which sort of offends them as deeply as anything could.
Yeah, there are several examples of that sort of thing, even in the book, where somebody's offering to help somebody else and the other person refuses help because the only freedom I have left is to refuse help.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding the sort of, feeling patronized or feeling humiliated by that, but just the idea that, I'm the last thing I can do is just refuse your help. That's Yeah. I was, as you're saying that too, I was just thinking about Alice too, who is, her husband is a doctor, and he's part of the colored elite, I think they're called.
He's definitely up on the talented 10th. He
and
get a stamp.
And at one point, Alice just wonders if she's just spending her time imitating a rich white woman, which is that, sort of almost not a foil, but, a sort of ballast to Pearl, that's sort of the North.
Alice is caught. I mean, they all are caught, but Alice, I think, very particularly is an example of a person who's caught in a very strange kind of house of mirrors with regard to class. She doesn't know, she wants to not be a part of what she came from, but she doesn't know how to be. She just has she's just sort of wandering around in a strange maze.
There's a line about her sort of absolutely loving what her husband's family has and hating it at the same time. It's just the most ambivalent possible.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So if this time anybody has any audience questions, we'd love to take a few. Ready?
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming, first
you.
of all. I want to kind of ask a question regarding to some of the last comments that you made around poverty. Can you speak a little bit about what may be considered, or did you give any thought when you were researching for the book, the psychology of poverty, or how that fits into the escalation of quote-unquote power of African American people as time has passed from the 30s, 40s up until now? If that's clear.
I sort of know what you're asking. You're sort of asking, actually rephrase, because I'm actually not sure what
I'm asking is, exactly. If you're looking at yourself in a elitist environment or state of mind, and it becomes almost impossible in some regard to move through society and grow and develop as a community, meaning as African American people, has that hindered us meaning me, African American, from being able to do so, because I have not been able to call you and say, Ayana, I'm working on this project, will you help me? I would rather scurry around trying to figure it out myself rather than being resourceful and calling someone who can bring some clarity to whatever it is that's going on. I mean, he kind of asked that question that it was you may be in bad shape, but to be in bad shape and not ask for help because you didn't want anybody to know that you were in bad shape, how do we move past that as a community?
I don't know. I wish I did. That's a big question.
The eternal question.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's it. That's an enormous question. I mean, certainly there is a legacy of in this book, and I think probably in general to some extent, there's a legacy of isolation that sort of keeps moving, down and down and down, and keeps getting passed on and on. I don't think of it in some ways as a problem of psychology, because I think that when you start invoking that word, then you start sort of invoking pathologies. Do you know what I mean? Like you start pathologizing the people that you are sort of attempting to understand, and I think that sort of route of, diagnosis of problem, solving of problem is not necessarily the way to actually sort of get anywhere. How do we get anywhere? I actually don't really know. Do you know what I mean? I have sort of no sense of how that kind of forward movement gets achieved. I have seen that it has. Do you know what I mean? Like even, when I sort of think about the arc of time that Hattie spans, we sort of start in 1925, and she's sort of just out of Georgia, and she flees because, white people killed her father, and in the last chapter in the book, it's 1980, and she has spent most of her life sort of in a place in which the possibility of hope seemed absolutely impossible to her. And when she gets to 1980, she arrives at a place where she thinks that it is possible to hope. It's not a dramatic kind of, do you know what I mean? It's not a dramatic, everything is all right and everything is better now, but it is a sort of perception of the possibility of hope or of betterment or of forward movement. And I think that there's sort of something in that. Certainly there are a lot of events that had to occur for her to get there. The civil rights movement had to happen. The women's rights movement had to happen. All these kinds of things. And I suppose that as those kinds of movements continue in different form, we're never going to sort of have a 1964 ever again, I don't think. And I think it would be irrelevant right now. But certainly there it is this kind of I like to think, perhaps I'm being overly hopeful, a kind of movement towards something that is better in that regard. How exactly it's achieved, I certainly don't know, but I think that it's probably not achieved by pathologizing or psychologizing in a way that becomes a diagnosis problem kind of model.
I guess when I think about the phrase, what you think is what you create. So on the one hand, you're saying, I think that I'm prosperous, I think that I'm this, and I think that I'm that, even though I may not be, and I bought into that possibility. On the other hand, you've got another group of people that probably during the course of time between 1925 and 1980 are saying, I think is what I create, so therefore I'm doing something to manifest that thought in my brain, whether it was the civil rights movement or a variety of other movements that brought us to a place where we are today. So it's, how do you balance that out in some regard? You know, some people who are still thinking that they're prosperous, but there's nothing in their bank account, their financial portfolio, their educational background that speaks to that. It's all in their head, but there's another group of people saying, I'm going to make the difference, I'm going to make the change. If you, I guess the question is, I wanted to kind of add to that, if you could take Hattie and put her in today's society now, 25 years later, what would be the message that she would come to as a result of all those years of living?
I mean, she's a striver. I think she always was, and I think that she always was. She's definitely a striver, you know, and I think she comes from a family of strivers, you know, with all their complications, but she's a striver for sure.
Do you have any other questions at this time? Okay.
I'm going to be greedy and ask 2 questions, so please forgive me. One, can you speak to what role God plays or played, or did I miss that? I'm sorry. No. Okay.
Please, it's a very good question. Thank you.
With respect to the title and also how the characters apprehend or perceive God and or religion. And second, who are your favorite authors?
Okay, so I'll answer the first one first, because it's the last one first, because it's cheating, because that's easy. Faulkner, Toni Morrison, they're just sort of 2 that come very. I read a lot of poetry as well, so lots of Philip Levine, Rita Dove, Yusef Komunyakaa, etc. I could keep going on, but that would be just because I'm procrastinating about answering the first part of the question, which is a really hard one. So I'll stop and I'll bite the bullet. I think these people's relationship to God is really it's really pretty complicated. None of them, except for Hattie's husband August in the last chapter, has anything that even remotely resembles a straightforward relationship to God. And August sort of comes as a result of his being sort of old and sick, and then he sort of finds the church, and he in his way decides that he is going to sort of fully embrace the church and the teachings of the church. And in this case, it's sort of like a Pentecostal kind of church. So he's sort of full in. Everyone else has an extraordinarily mingled relationship with it. And we were sort of talking earlier, and now I'm gonna like dither around and be incoherent for a while. But the last chapter of the book, there's a sermon. It takes place sort of in a small church, and there's a sermon, and the sermon is about the book of Job. And the sermon, I think one of the reasons that sort of there is on a certain level is kind of to say, well, we've looked at all of these people, we looked at Hattie and the lives of all of her children and all of this difficulty and tribulation, et cetera, and so the temptation, of course, is to say, well, why have they gone through all of this? Do you know what I mean? And that question can, of course, be asked in theological terms, like, why has God done this to me? As well as it can be asked in purely secular terms, like, why has this happened, sort of period, And the book, I think, is asking that question more in secular terms, though certainly taking a framework of a kind of biblical, a sort of theological framework, it's sort of modeling that. And I think that there is no answer to the question, which is why Job is sort of invoked, because the sort of amazing thing about the book of Job is that it doesn't actually answer the question. What it almost says is, why is not the right question, that suffering is the case, as the world is the case, as being in the world is the case, as the beauty of the world is the case, and that these are all kind of part and parcel of the same experience of being a human being on the earth. And so I think, my own sort of ambivalence and questions about God and faith and all of that aside, which certainly that's the stuff in the book about God is also kind of an expression of my own kinds of ambivalence and wondering. But it also seemed to me that Job somehow poses the question of why, or rather rebuts the question of why, in a deeply poetic and deeply elegant kind of way. And so this notion of what a human being's relationship is to God is at the end of the day a series of questions about why we suffer, why we are alive, why we die, why we don't understand the world in which we find ourselves. And if I take God out of the equation, which I do to some extent in the book, I suppose that it's asking those same kinds of questions, but using a kind of theological framework to ask them. I don't know if that makes any sense. That was a very long answer, but that's the answer. The title is just, it's a direct sort of, directly taken from the Old Testament, the 12 Tribes of Israel. And again, it's just sort of a metaphor, I think, for, people moving from bondage into a freedom that they find to be much more mingled and difficult than they ever assumed that it was going to be, which is, sort of exactly kind of what happens to the chosen people,
Wonderful. Did anybody have a final question for us? Okay.
Hello. I walked in towards the later half of the talk, but you mentioned the community in Pennsylvania where, if you live in this community, and even if you're struggling, you don't, take a handout. But then how are you supposed to survive? Like, how are you supposed to make it?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think that I have any answers about how one would, so much as I think about the ways in which this community kind of functions, which was to, and certainly they suffer, and some of that I think is embodied in the character of Hattie. She's a woman who goes through enormous kinds of hardship and enormous sorts of difficulties, and one of the things that sort of damns her in her life, that makes her life sort of verge up against unlivable, though it is not unlivable, but one of the things that brings her closest to that is the fact that she refuses to accept help. She refuses to accept comfort even on its most basic level. She refuses even to go across the street and have a cup of tea with a neighbor, which, while that certainly wouldn't reverse the difficulties of her circumstance, would make her circumstance a lot more livable and bearable, and she sort of won't do it. And that is the case with this particular book, with these particular people in this particular community. They are very often that group of people who are in that sort of capacity, their own kinds of worst enemies, or the worst enemies to their own kinds of comfort in the world, and certainly it does make it more difficult for them to sort of get by. I think in a larger sense, their situation is and when I say a larger sense, I mean sort of economically and socially and all that kind of stuff. Their kind of incredible, I hate words like perseverance, but I'll use it because it's such a cliche and it's kind of an awful word. But at any rate, their mettle, or whatever you want to call it, certainly does kind of eventually, I think, help to get them out of the sort of physical circumstances in which they find themselves, but the sort of emotional and spiritual circumstances in which they find themselves are nominally improved, but certainly not as much as they could have been if they could find a way to not be so isolated from one another.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you to Paul and Ayana. This was very lovely. At this time, we're going to have